I didn't, and I didn't believe it would happen, but the secretary of the institution wrote to me and said, well, there's this new book that just came out that's a translation of Frederick II's treatise on falconry, and you should get that. So I bought that book, and that helped me more than anything else, because that book tells it all. And I still have the copy of the book. It's over 70 years old now. It's an antique.
So when you were with this club that had club birds, so goshawk, peregrine, I mean, peregrine has featured very, very much for you, hasn't it? The peregrine. When you came to the point of learning that the peregrine was in danger, you say because of pesticides. Do you think that was the point which really started you on the path towards initiating the Peregrine Fund?
Yeah, that actually happened in 1965.
Right.
That was when there was by that time people were pretty well aware that things were really seriously wrong, yeah. both in Europe and in North America. And a professor named Joseph Hickey at the University of Wisconsin brought together an international meeting of people who had some expertise with peregrines, and a lot of them were falconers. Actually, about half the group were falconers, and other egg collectors, whoever had been out and had been making observations of the disappearance of these birds, brought them all together to see if we could puzzle out, what the reason was. And of course, everybody had different ideas. And one guy thought that raccoons had become much more abundant than they used to be, and that they were raiding the nests and taking the eggs and that sort of thing. And there were various weird ideas like that. But the Brits, British scientists, had gotten on to the pesticide idea. And so but it was circumstantial evidence only. But what they observed was that the use of DDT was basically a post-war thing. I mean, it was used in the military for mosquito control, particularly in our campaigns in the Pacific. And so it was known to be a powerful mosquito-killing agent, and then it was immediately converted to agricultural and forestry uses after the war, and that was what did the falcons in. And the Brits, a guy named Derek Radcliffe in particular, who had been commissioned to, during the war in Britain, they controlled peregrines on the south coast of England, because they were afraid that they would interfere with the messenger pigeons used by the military. And so they shot all the nests out and killed all the young and so on in that part of Britain, all during the war. But they never did wipe the peregrines out. They were always replaced the next year. So anyway, then the pigeon people there were complaining to the government that too many of their homing pigeons were being killed by peregrines, and they wanted something done about it. So the government, they were a little bit skeptical about whether that was the case or not, but they hired Derek Radcliffe to look into it, to do a study, basically of how much of the peregrine's food consisted of homing pigeons. And sure enough, turned out that quite a few homing pigeons were being taken by the peregrines. But the basic thing that after he'd been working for about a year or so, he started noticing that peregrines were gone. And again, at first, people thought, well, the gamekeepers or somebody were shooting too many of them. But then they were just rapidly disappearing. And he came to the conclusion, after kind of seeing what the geographic pattern of this disappearance was, it started where DDT and later deodorant had been used in agriculture. And it started in the south of England, and then the use of the insecticides kind of moved northward from southern England finally up into Scotland, and the disappearance of the peregrines corresponded exactly with that pattern of use.
Yes.
And so he came to the conclusion that, well, either they were being poisoned or something. I mean, there was something associated with DDT that was a problem, and that was the information that he brought to this conference that Joe Hickey put together in Wisconsin, and everybody immediately that seemed to kind of fit also the pattern in North America, but on a much larger geographic scale, of course. Then very soon after that, Radcliffe did this eggshell thinning study, in which he showed that using museum, and this is where the museum egg collections finally came into good scientific use, because he had materials going all the way back to the late 1800s, so he could see what the eggshell thickness was year by year from say 1850 or so right down to the present time, because eggs were still being collected by the British egg collectors, even during this period of decline, which turned out to be a fortunate thing, because he was able to show graphically and statistically that very suddenly in 1947 there was a huge decrease in eggshell thickness in peregrines, which corresponded exactly in time with when DDT was first starting to be used in agriculture. And the same pattern was shown in North America by Joe Hickey, actually, and his students. And then later on, there were laboratory studies done to give feeding birds DDT, not peregrines, but other birds, to show that if DDT is added to their diet, their eggshells thin. And so that was the solid proof that that was the main cause. And of course that ended the use of the peregrine in falconry for quite a while. Everybody turned their attention to trying to figure out what to do to solve the problem. And getting rid of DDT was the obvious thing, which did finally happen after about 5 years after Joe Hickey's. What would it have been? It would have been a little bit more than that. It was in at least in this. It happened at different times in different countries, depending on the governments. We banned it in 1972. The Canadians banned it in 1969. They were the first, I think. So 72 from 60, it would have been about, 7 years?
Span of 7 years.
Yeah. It was banned, and almost immediately, which is another curious thing. Almost immediately, the birds responded to that and started coming back. And by the late 70s, they were coming back strongly. And in the 80s, it exploded. And in the 80s and the 90s, both, birds were just popping up everywhere. And then the strange thing, this is not about falconry, but that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
The strange thing about all that to me was that they actually increased beyond what they were known to have been before DDT. And now we have them nesting in cities that have man-made structures all over the world now. they never did that very much in the past. I mean, occasionally they would nest on a cathedral or a castle or
Yes,
something,
yes.
but it was a very rare thing for them to do. But now, I mean, like New York City has got 30, I think, 30 pairs of peregrines in the greater New York City area. London has London and New York City are now vying
yes.
with each other for who has the most peregrines. And it's like that everywhere, and it's and even in India and in Africa, they're now nesting in cities.
Wow,
Australia even.
Is that so much that the cities are encroaching upon the territory of the peregrine?
But it seems strange that why are they doing it now? They never did it before,
Yes.
to any great extent. It's a strange thing. But anyway, we've got many peregrines now, and but still limited use of them for falconry. And we are allowed to take a small number of wild-caught ones. I mean, of course, captive breeding came on. I didn't even talk about that, but captive breeding is what saved falconry, particularly in Europe. There would have been no falconry here in this part of the world now if it hadn't been for captive breeding, I think.
Now, I understand you were fairly integral in the pioneering captive breeding.
Well, when this Hickey meeting occurred, there was a group of us. Well, I had to go back. I was on sabbatical leave actually then in South Africa, and I got had a special arrangement to come to the Hickey meeting. I don't know. This is kind of an interesting sidebar, but I had been in communication with Hickey before about the peregrine because he had a history of a scientific interest in it.
Yeah.
And so when I was working on it for my degree, I communicated with him fairly often, so we got to be pretty good friends. And so when I heard that he was going to have this meeting, I was in South Africa. And I said, Joe, I really would like to come to the meeting, but I don't have enough money to travel all the way from South Africa to Wisconsin. And he said, well, I have a grant, travel grant, that I got from a thing called the Rachel Carson Fund, which is a fund that was administered by the National Audubon Society. And he said, but it's only for to support travel of foreigners to the meeting. So I wish I could help you, but there's nothing I can do. And so I was kind of moping around, wondering. And so one of the people that he wanted to have come was a very famous peregrine expert from Russia.
All right.
Named Georgy Dementiev, and he really wanted Dementiev there, and he even went to our State Department because Dementiev was, as you might expect, having trouble with the government to get permission to leave, and so Joe even went to our State Department to have this State Department kind of intervene and urge the Russians to let this guy out, and they wouldn't do it. He never got to come.
Oh,
and so at the very last minute, Joe said, you can have the money I was going to bring Dementiev with, and you can use it instead. So that's how I got to go.
So what?
But then we had a run. Like I said, there were quite a few falconers there at that meeting because they were the ones who knew where the birds were and had been making observations on these disappearances that were occurring. And so that meeting again, it was organized by a falconer named Don Hunter. And he actually also founded the Raptor Research Foundation in the United States as a consequence of this meeting. After Hickey's meeting, the falconers who were there, and there were 2 or 3 other scientists there as well. But I couldn't stay. I had to go back to Africa. But anyway, they 2 things that emerged was that they talked quite a bit about captive breeding, and they kind of thought that that would be the way to go, to at least maybe save the bird in captivity if in fact you couldn't get them back in the field. And then the second was to organize that as an organization. And so that was how the Raptor Research Foundation actually came into existence. It was primarily to learn how to breed peregrine falcons in captivity. Right. And of course then over the years it transformed into a full-fledged scientific specialty on raptor studies worldwide. But the first few years was all devoted to captive breeding of raptors, and so that got me in. I had already, thought about that myself independently, but being connected with the Raptor Research Foundation helped me even more. But I had bred kestrels in captivity when I was a graduate student at UCLA. And then later when I went from there, I went to, after I got my degree, I went to the Syracuse University. That's where I was at the time of Hickey's meeting. And I had a graduate student who did a master's degree on breeding kestrels in captivity. So I had some experience with that species, and it was just a matter of kind of transferring some of the stuff that we'd learned from the kestrels to the peregrines. But in addition, of course, the peregrine had been bred a couple of times, 3 or 4 times prior to that, most famously by a German falconer in the middle of the World War II. Yeah. He lived in Dusseldorf, and during the bombing of Dusseldorf in 42 and 43, I think it was, he had a pair of peregrines that he kept in an old mews, and that bred and raised young 2 years in a row during the war when bombs were, and it was when Dusseldorf was one of the most heavily bombed cities in Germany. And he was able to do that by keeping his birds alive, mainly by feeding them alley cats. Because, it was a tough time.
Yes.
And that was the only source of food that he had available. Right? So, but nobody knew about it. Very few people, other than a few German falconers, knew about that until much later. We didn't find out about it until about the time of Joe Hickey's conference in '65, and a couple of other people had similar successes. A guy named Heinz Meng in particular, who just died recently, as a matter of fact, had a pair of Peel's falcons. One of the things that the Raptor Research Foundation did was to send out some guys to collect peregrines where it was still possible to find some. And the Peel's falcon was never affected very much by DDT, unlike the so-called anatom peregrine. There are several different subspecies of peregrines in North America, and the Peel's is a big one, a big peregrine. Several of those were brought into captivity, and one pair went to Heinz Meng, and he bred them successfully. And in 1 year, by pulling eggs, taking eggs away, and then they would lay more eggs, he raised 7 young in 1 year from a single pair of birds, and that was a pretty phenomenal thing that he did. And then later he gave those birds to us at Cornell, we raised many birds from them also. And then eventually gave them back to Heinz. So they lasted a long time. But
so when you were learning about captive breeding, were there many obstacles what kind of obstacles did you come across? Because, I mean, I can only think in this day and age where dissemination of information is so easy with the internet and email, but in those days, you know, it really, there were only a few people.
Well, you know, there's again where the Raptor Research Foundation provided a good function because they decided to put out a thing called the Breeding Project Information Exchange.
Right.
And this was a system where whenever a guy who was, or there were some ladies also involved, whenever they learned something or got a technique that worked or something, they would write this up quickly. Right. And it would be Xeroxed. I don't know whether you even know what Xeroxing is. But it was a mimeograph type publication that you could put out very quickly. Okay. And they mailed it out to everybody. So everybody who was involved in trying to breed peregrines or other raptors in captivity could learn what the other person had found. The information was freely shared, which doesn't happen anymore. But at that time, people were so concerned about getting the thing going particularly with the peregrine, that everybody shared what they knew. So that was a big help, and that was the major function, I would say, that the Raptor Research Foundation played in peregrine recovery. Although they did do these collecting trips as well to get birds to use, and then the falconers themselves, those who had peregrines, many of them turned them over to breeders, to use, and that was another big help that the falconry community made to saving the peregrine, actually.
So at what point did the Peregrine Fund come into play for you?
Yeah, so I after that meeting, I was still in Africa, but I was determined to get into captive breeding of peregrines as soon as I got back to Syracuse University. And so when I got back to Syracuse, I